When he said those words, I felt something inside me fall apart quietly, like a fragile piece of glass, slipping from your hand and breaking before you even realize it's gone. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a fight. It was just one sentence. Simple, cold, and unforgettable. He said I never supported him. For a few seconds, I couldn't even breathe. I just stared at him, wondering if he really meant it, or if he was just angry and trying to hurt me. But deep down, I knew. He meant every word. And that hurt more than anything else. It's strange how words can feel heavier than years of silence. I kept standing there in the kitchen, my hands still wet from washing the dishes, staring at the floor. The coffee on the table had gone cold, but I didn't even notice. I just kept hearing his voice again and again. You never supported me. How could he forget everything? How could he erase all those years of love, care, and sacrifices in one single line? It felt like someone took my entire life and crossed it out with a red pen. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I just stood there quietly. Because sometimes silence is the only thing left when love turns into disappointment. That night was colder than usual. The wind outside was strong, and I could hear it rattling the windows. But the real storm was inside me. My heart was trembling. My chest hurt. My mind wouldn't stop repeating that sentence. I tried to distract myself. I cleaned the counter, folded laundry, watered the plants. But everything in the house reminded me of him, of us. The couch where we used to sit together, the coffee mugs we bought last winter, the half-finished puzzle on the dining table that we said we'd finish someday. Now, I wondered if that someday would ever come. I wanted to cry, but the tears didn't come easily. It was like my body was too tired to react, so I just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty side where he used to sleep. He came home late that night, as usual. He didn't say anything to me. No apology, no explanation, just silence. The kind of silence that fills every corner of the room until you can't breathe. He slept. I didn't. I lay there all night watching the ceiling, feeling like a stranger in my own life. I kept asking myself what I did wrong, what I missed, where I failed. And every answer led back to the same truth. I had given everything I could. Sometimes love makes you blind, but heartbreak makes you see. That night, I saw everything clearly. The distance, the neglect, the way he'd started looking past me instead of at me. The truth is, it didn't start that day. It had been building up slowly, through missed conversations, broken eye contact, and careless words. But that sentence, it was the final crack that split everything open. The next morning I woke up early. The sun was rising through the blinds, painting golden lines across the wall. I used to love mornings, the smell of coffee, the sound of birds, the quiet before the day began. But that morning it all felt heavy, like a movie playing without sound. I made breakfast out of habit, toast, eggs, and his favorite black coffee. He didn't touch it. He just took his keys, said something about being late, and left. No goodbye, no glance, nothing. I sat there, staring at the food getting cold on the table, and it hit me. I wasn't part of his life anymore. I was just part of his routine. It's a painful realization, brother, to understand that you still exist in someone's life, but not in their heart. All day, I went through motions, cleaned the house, folded clothes, watered plants, but my mind was somewhere else. It kept returning to that moment, that sentence. It echoed like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. You never supported me. I kept thinking about the nights I stayed awake, waiting for him to come home. The times I bit my tongue instead of arguing because I didn't want to hurt him. The moments I celebrated his small victories, even when no one else cared. Was that not support? Was that not love? But people forget, brother. They forget the quiet things, the sacrifices you never mention, the things you do when no one's watching. Maybe that's the saddest part of love, how invisible it becomes when the other person stops looking. That evening, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The sky was soft pink, and the air smelled like rain. I watched the streetlights flicker on, one by one, and felt this strange emptiness inside me. Not anger, not hatred, just nothing. I realized how much energy it takes to keep something alive when the other person has already given up. For so long I thought if I tried harder, stayed patient, loved deeply enough, he'd come back to me emotionally, mentally, spiritually. But love doesn't work like that. It needs two hearts trying. I remember the day I first noticed the change in his eyes. It wasn't hatred, it was distance. He had dreams, goals, new plans, all of which no longer included me. I used to be his partner. Now I was just the background of his success. He was growing, and somehow I was shrinking in his world. It hurts when someone you built a life with makes you feel like a guest in your own home. Every wall, every photo, every memory whispers something that doesn't belong to you anymore. I tried to sleep again that night, but the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that screams at you. So I got up, made myself tea, and sat near the window. The same spot where we used to talk late at night. I looked out at the dark street, the wet road shining under the streetlights, and I whispered to myself, he really thinks I never supported him. That was the moment it sank in completely. The man I loved no longer saw me. He saw a version of me that only existed in his complaints, not in reality. He had rewritten the story of our life in his head, and in that story, I was the obstacle. It's strange how quickly love can turn into misunderstanding. You give your heart, your time, your soul, and one day, it's as if it never happened. People see what they want to see. He saw his success as something he achieved alone. He saw his pain as something I caused. And me? I saw everything, every little crack, every small distance, every unspoken word. That night I didn't cry, not because I didn't want to, but because the tears had already dried somewhere along the way. Maybe pain doesn't always show through tears. Sometimes it just lives quietly in your chest, like an uninvited guest that refuses to leave. I realized something that night. Love doesn't end when someone stops saying, I love you. It ends when you start feeling invisible. And that's what I had become. Invisible in my own home, invisible in his world, invisible in the story I helped him write. He forgot everything, but I remembered every detail. The way his eyes used to light up when I walked into the room. The way he used to reach for my hand without thinking. The way he used to say we instead of me. Now there was no we, just silence, and me. That was the day everything broke. Not loudly, not violently, but quietly. Like the way a heart gives up after holding on for too long. And even though I didn't know it yet, that was the day I started letting go. Days began to blur together. Morning felt the same as night. The only sound that filled the house anymore was the hum of the refrigerator and the clock ticking in the hallway, reminding me that time was moving forward, even if I wasn't. Bella sat by the window most mornings, a cup of coffee resting on the small wooden table beside her. The coffee always went cold before she could drink it. It wasn't about the taste anymore. It was about the habit. A way to pretend that life was still normal. She'd watch the world outside, the kids walking to school, the neighbors mowing their lawns, couples holding hands on the sidewalk. All those small, ordinary things that used to make her smile once. Now they just made her wonder where she went wrong. There was a time when her husband, Daniel, would join her in the mornings. He'd sit beside her, share a few jokes, talk about his work plans, or tease her for always adding too much sugar to her coffee. Now he didn't even notice whether she was there or not. He'd leave early for work, sometimes without breakfast, sometimes without a word. And when he returned at night, he'd be buried in his phone or laptop, his face glowing from the screen light, but darkened by indifference. Bella had become part of the furniture, always there, always quiet, always unseen. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was normal. And that's what scared her the most. She had learned to live inside it. One evening, as she was setting the table for dinner, Daniel walked in late again. His tie was loose, his sleeves rolled up, and he looked exhausted. Not from work, but from being around her. He didn't say a word when he saw the food, didn't even look at her. He just poured himself a glass of water, took a few bites, and went upstairs. That used to be the time when Bella would ask about his day, share small stories, laugh about silly things. Now she didn't dare. She was afraid even her words might annoy him. So she sat alone at the table, eating quietly, pretending she was fine, pretending that silence was enough to fill the space where love used to live. That night, as she cleaned the dishes, she caught a glimpse of herself in the kitchen window. Tired eyes, messy hair, a reflection of someone who used to dream but had forgotten how to. She whispered softly, "Who are you now, Bella?" Her voice cracked as the words came out. It had been days since she had spoken to anyone except Daniel, and he never replied. She went to bed after him, as usual. The bed felt colder each night, even though he was still there. He slept facing the other side, and she lay quietly, staring at his back, remembering when he used to pull her closer in his sleep. Now there was only distance, physical, emotional, spiritual, and it was growing every day. The next weekend, Bella decided to do something different. She dressed up a little, wore the blue dress Daniel once said made her eyes look like the morning sky. She cooked his favorite meal, grilled chicken with rosemary and mashed potatoes. She even lit candles on the dining table, just like old times. When he walked in, she smiled softly. "Hey," she said. "I thought maybe we could have dinner together tonight." He looked at the table, then at her, and forced a half smile. "I'm tired, Bella," he said, loosening his tie. "Can we not do this right now?" Her smile faded, but she nodded anyway. "Of course," she whispered. He walked past her, up the stairs, and shut the bedroom door. Bella stood there, the smell of freshly cooked food filling the air, the candles flickering in front of her. A dinner made for two, now meant for one. She sat down at the table, picked up her fork, and tried to eat, but her throat tightened with every bite. Tears started rolling down her cheeks, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, falling onto the plate. That's the kind of pain that doesn't scream. It just sits beside you, holding your hand, whispering that you're alone now. Later that night, when she went upstairs, Daniel was already asleep. His phone was lying on the nightstand, the screen still glowing with a message. She didn't mean to look, but something inside her made her glance at it. Maybe curiosity, maybe fear. It was a message from someone named Lydia, short, simple, but sharp enough to make Bella's heart drop. "I wish you were here instead of there." For a few seconds she couldn't move. Her hands trembled, her breath got heavy, and her eyes blurred with tears she didn't want to believe in. She placed the phone back exactly as it was and quietly stepped away. She didn't want to wake him, or maybe she didn't want to face the truth. She went downstairs, sat on the couch, and wrapped her arms around herself like she was holding on to the last pieces of warmth in her life. That message, just 8 words, changed everything. It wasn't just about another woman. It was about the realization that she had already lost him, long before that text appeared. Emotionally, he had left her months ago. Now it was just confirmed. The next morning, she didn't cry. She didn't confront him. She didn't even ask. She simply smiled, made coffee, and acted like everything was normal. Because sometimes pretending is easier than breaking down. Daniel didn't notice the difference. He never did. He kissed her on the forehead before leaving, something he hadn't done in months. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was habit. Either way, it didn't matter. Because Bella knew now, their love story wasn't fading. It had already ended. Only the pages were still turning. That day, she sat by the window again, watching the world move forward while her own life stood still. She realized something profound. Silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means goodbye. And in that silence, she finally understood. She could either keep waiting for him to see her again, or she could learn to see herself. The next few days felt like walking through fog. Everything looked the same. The same kitchen, the same mornings, the same routines. But something in the air had shifted. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was emptiness. Bella moved around the house quietly, like a ghost in her own life. She cooked, cleaned, folded laundry, and watered the plants. All the things she used to do with love, but now they felt meaningless. Every plate she set on the table, every shirt she ironed, reminded her that love had become a habit, not a feeling. Daniel didn't notice, or maybe he did, but didn't care anymore. He still went to work, came home late, and spent hours staring at his phone. Some nights he didn't even come home at all, saying there were business meetings that ran late. Bella didn't question him. She didn't have the strength to anymore. When trust is gone, silence becomes the only language left. She stopped waiting for him, stopped expecting his attention, his smile, his love. Instead, she learned to live around his absence, like it was just another piece of furniture she had to walk around carefully. She'd sit on the couch, watching shows they once loved to watch together, pretending not to notice how lonely the laughter sounded without him. She'd fall asleep on one side of the bed, leaving space for a man who no longer cared to fill it. The hardest part wasn't his distance. It was the small hope that still whispered, "Maybe tomorrow will be different." That hope was both her comfort and her curse. One afternoon, while folding laundry, Bella found one of his old shirts, the faded gray one he used to wear on weekends when they went out for coffee. She held it close to her chest and breathed in softly. It no longer smelled like him, just detergent and dust. She sat down on the edge of the bed and closed her eyes. There was no big fight, no screaming, no storm, just a slow, quiet death of something once beautiful. That's how love often ends, not with noise, but with silence. The next morning, Bella went for a walk around the neighborhood. It was early, the streets still wet from last night's rain. She saw an old couple sitting on their porch, sharing coffee and a quiet laugh. The woman's hand rested gently on her husband's knee. That small gesture felt louder than words. Bella smiled faintly, but her eyes filled with tears. That used to be her once. That used to be them. She walked a little further and stopped by the bakery where Daniel once surprised her with a cupcake on her birthday. Now she stood there alone, looking at the display, realizing how something so small could carry so much memory. Love wasn't about the big promises, she thought. It was always in the small things. A shared laugh, a look across the table, a warm hand to hold, and those were exactly the things that had disappeared. That evening, she cooked dinner again, though she knew he wouldn't show up on time. She didn't do it to impress him anymore. She did it to hold on to some piece of herself, the part that still cared, even when it hurt. When he came home late, she didn't ask why. She simply said, "There's food on the table," and went upstairs. He didn't follow. Lying in bed, Bella stared at the ceiling and whispered softly to herself, "This is not love anymore." For the first time, saying it out loud didn't make her cry. It made her feel free, and that scared her. Because freedom meant letting go, and letting go meant accepting the truth she'd been running from. A few days later, while sorting old photos, Bella found their wedding picture. They looked so young, so full of dreams. She remembered how everyone said they were meant for each other. She believed it too. But looking at that photo now, she realized something heartbreaking. They weren't meant for each other anymore. People change. Love changes. And sometimes it fades, not because someone stops caring, but because they stop seeing each other. She ran her fingers over the picture, tracing the smiles that no longer existed, and placed it back inside the box. She didn't tear it. She didn't throw it away. She just closed the lid, like closing a chapter that once meant everything. Nights became longer. Sleep didn't come easily. Her mind replayed old moments, not in nostalgia, but in quiet mourning. She remembered the way Daniel used to look at her when she laughed, how he used to hold her hand when they crossed the street, how he once promised, "I'll never stop choosing you." Now he couldn't even choose a conversation. That's the cruel thing about love. When it dies, it doesn't leave a scar you can see, it leaves silence, and silence can be deafening. One Sunday morning, Bella finally decided to visit her friend Grace. She hadn't seen anyone in weeks. Grace noticed the change immediately, the dimness in Bella's eyes, the forced smile. They talked over tea, mostly about small things, work, the weather, life. But in between sips, Grace said gently, "You look tired, Bella. You don't have to pretend everything's fine." Bella smiled, but her eyes softened. "I'm not pretending," she whispered. "I'm just learning how to stop expecting." That was the most honest thing she had said in months. When she returned home that evening, Daniel was there, sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. For a second, she almost said something, but then she realized there was nothing left to say. Words had lost their meaning, so she walked past him quietly, like a stranger in her own house. And for the first time, she didn't feel sad. She just felt done. That's when she understood. Love doesn't always end in anger. Sometimes it just ends when you finally stop trying, and that realization hurt more than any fight ever could. There comes a moment when silence becomes heavier than words, when every corner of your home feels like a reminder of what used to be. Bella had reached that moment. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was a slow, quiet ache, one that had been building for too long. She woke up one morning and realized she didn't feel anything anymore. Not sadness, not anger, just nothing. And that emptiness scared her more than heartbreak ever did. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her knees, staring at the wall. Daniel was still asleep beside her, his breathing calm, his world untouched by her pain. She looked at him for a long time, trying to remember what it felt like to love him, but all she could see was a stranger she once knew. That was the moment Bella knew something inside her had finally broken, not in pieces, but in silence. That day she went about her chores as usual. She made breakfast, folded laundry, watered the plants on the porch. But her mind was somewhere else, somewhere far away, where her heart no longer had to pretend it was okay. Daniel left for work without saying goodbye. She didn't wait for him to. The sound of the door closing behind him didn't sting anymore. It just felt expected. When the house grew quiet again, Bella sat down at the dining table, staring at the empty chair across from her. How many mornings had she waited for him to fill that seat? How many evenings had she kept dinner warm, believing maybe tonight he'd come home early? The truth was, she'd been waiting for a man who wasn't coming back, not because he was gone, but because he had already left her emotionally long ago. That afternoon, she opened her closet. Inside were dresses she hadn't worn in months, soft pastels, floral prints, clothes that once made her feel beautiful. Now they just looked like costumes from another life. She ran her hand over the fabric and whispered, "I miss who I used to be." It wasn't about Daniel anymore. It was about the version of herself she had lost, trying to keep someone else happy. She packed a few of her clothes into a suitcase, not because she had decided to leave that very second, but because she knew she would soon have to. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to think about freedom, not as escape, but as healing. That night, Daniel came home later than usual. The smell of alcohol lingered on his clothes. He looked tired, distracted, and annoyed. Bella didn't ask where he had been. She didn't need to. She just stood near the doorway, watching him drop his jacket on the couch, loosen his tie, and pour himself a drink. He didn't notice her standing there. He rarely did anymore. After a long pause, she quietly said, "Dinner's on the table." He didn't respond. He just turned on the TV, the sound of sports filling the room, drowning out everything that should have been said between them. Bella stood there for another moment, then walked away. Something in her heart whispered, "This is the last time you'll do this." Later that night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window again, the moonlight spilling softly across the floor. It was quiet, but not peaceful, the kind of silence that presses on your chest until you can barely breathe. She looked out at the street, the faint glow of porch lights flickering from the houses across the road. Somewhere out there, people were laughing, living, loving. And here she was, existing in the same world but feeling completely alone. She picked up her phone, opened her notes app, and started typing. Not a message, not a goodbye, just her feelings, words she never said out loud. "I gave you everything I had, my time, my care, my patience. I stood beside you when you had nothing. But somewhere along the way, I disappeared. You stopped seeing me, and I forgot how to see myself." When she read it back, her tears began to fall quietly. It wasn't anger. It wasn't blame. It was grief, the kind that comes when you finally accept that love has died. The next morning, she made breakfast as usual, though her hands trembled slightly as she buttered the toast. Daniel came downstairs, looking at his phone, barely glancing her way. As he reached for his keys, he paused and said in a flat tone, "You've been quiet lately. Is something wrong?" It almost made her laugh. That was the first time he had asked her that in months. And he didn't even look up from his phone. She wanted to tell him everything, that she was tired, that she had been breaking in silence for months, that she missed them, missed who they used to be, but she knew it wouldn't matter. He wasn't really listening, so she just said softly, "No, nothing's wrong." And he nodded, walked out, and left her standing there in the quiet again. After he left, Bella stood at the sink, watching the sunlight touch the edge of the window pane. Her reflection looked calm, almost peaceful. But inside, something had shifted. It was over now. Not because she stopped loving him, but because she couldn't keep loving someone who didn't care if she did. She finished her coffee, went to her room, and looked at the packed suitcase in the corner. This time, she didn't cry. She just unzipped it and started folding the rest of her things inside. Her movements were slow, steady, and deliberate, like someone who had finally made peace with a hard truth. Each item she packed was a piece of herself she was reclaiming. When she zipped the suitcase shut, she took a deep breath and whispered, "You did your best, Bella. You really did." She sat down for a moment, letting the silence settle around her. And for the first time in a long time, that silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like clarity. Because sometimes, the moment you stop chasing love that doesn't want to stay is the moment you finally start to find yourself again. It was early morning when Bella woke up, before the sun had even risen. The world outside was still gray, the streets empty, the air cool. For a moment, she sat there in bed, listening to the faint hum of silence that filled the house. This was the same silence that used to hurt her, but today, it felt different. It felt final. She got up quietly, careful not to wake Daniel. He was still asleep, turned away from her as usual, one arm hanging off the bed. He looked peaceful, maybe even happy, and that made her chest tighten in an odd mix of sadness and acceptance. Bella stood there for a few seconds, just looking at him. This man she had loved for so many years. This man who had once promised forever, but forgot that forever needs care. She whispered softly, not to wake him, but to release what she had carried for too long. I loved you, Daniel. I really did. Then she turned away, and she didn't look back again. Downstairs, the house felt colder than ever. The morning light slipped through the curtains, touching the table where they once sat together, laughing, dreaming, planning their future. Now it was just an empty table. Bella placed a small envelope on it. Inside, she had written a short letter, not out of bitterness, but as a quiet goodbye. The letter said, I hope one day you understand that love is not about staying when it hurts. It's about remembering when to let go. I supported you in ways you never saw. I believed in you when you doubted yourself, but you forgot that I was there, always. I can't keep living in a home where my heart no longer belongs. Take care of yourself, Daniel. Goodbye, Bella. She folded it neatly and left it under his coffee mug, the same mug she washed for him every morning. She walked to her closet, picked up her suitcase, and looked around the living room one last time. Every corner of that house had a story. The couch where they watched movies, the kitchen where they danced on rainy nights, the porch where he once told her she was his home. Now it was just a house, walls and furniture without meaning. She took a deep breath, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the doorknob. For a moment, her mind whispered, maybe he'll wake up, maybe he'll stop you, maybe he'll say he's sorry. But the house stayed quiet. And that silence was her answer. She opened the door and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, the world still quiet except for the faint chirping of birds. Her car was parked at the curb. She placed her bag in the back seat, closed the trunk gently, and stood there for a while. It wasn't just a goodbye to a man, it was a goodbye to an entire chapter of her life. She stopped at a red light and glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were tired, but steady. Her face looked softer somehow, like the weight she'd carried for so long had finally lifted. In that moment, she whispered to herself, "You did the right thing." And deep down, she knew it was true. Because staying had become a kind of slow death. Leaving was painful, but it was also survival. Later that morning, Daniel woke up. He reached out to the other side of the bed. Empty. He frowned slightly, sat up, and called out her name. No answer. He walked downstairs, still half asleep, and saw the envelope on the table. The coffee mug was in its place, but the house felt strangely hollow. He opened the letter and read it slowly, his expression changing from confusion to disbelief. And then silence. He sat down on the chair, his head in his hands, the words echoing in his mind. I supported you in ways you never saw. For the first time in months, he looked around the house and realized how quiet it had always been, not because she was gone, but because he had stopped listening long ago. Bella didn't know what he was feeling, and she didn't need to. This goodbye wasn't about him anymore. It was about her, choosing herself, choosing freedom, choosing to finally heal. She drove past the small park where they once had picnics, past the grocery store where they used to argue over which cereal to buy, past all the little places that held pieces of their love. Each one felt like a page turning. Each mile she drove was a step closer to herself. By the time the town faded behind her, Bella rolled down the window. The wind touched her face softly, carrying the faint scent of rain and new beginnings. She smiled. Not a wide smile, just a small, quiet one. The kind that comes when you finally realize that you're going to be okay. For the first time, the silence around her didn't hurt. It felt like peace. It felt like freedom. And even though her heart still ached, she knew this. Some endings are not failures. They're beginnings disguised as pain. The days after leaving felt like stepping into a world she had forgotten existed. The first morning, Bella woke up in a small rented room above a cafe. The curtains were thin, letting sunlight spill across the white bedsheet, and for the first time in years, she woke up not to the sound of his alarm or the smell of his coffee, but to silence that was entirely her own. It was strange at first. The quiet felt unfamiliar, almost too large. Every sound, the creak of the floor, the whistle of the kettle, echoed differently now. But she didn't cry. She just sat there, wrapped in a blanket, holding her cup of tea, watching the steam rise and fade. And in that small moment, she felt something fragile but real: peace. She spent her days walking, no destination, no plans, just walking, through parks, down quiet streets, near the river. Sometimes she thought about Daniel, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of soft sadness. She wondered if he was still in that house, sitting at that table, staring at the note she left behind. She wondered if he finally realized what he had lost. But she also knew it didn't matter anymore. That chapter was closed. There was no satisfaction in imagining him regretful, only an ache for the love that could have been, but never was. A week passed, then 2, then a month. Life didn't suddenly become easy, but it became hers. She got a small job at a nearby bookstore, helping customers find their next read. She liked the quiet of it, the smell of old paper, the soft rustle of pages turning, the slow rhythm of a life being rebuilt. Every night, she'd walk back to her little room, sometimes stopping for a cup of soup from the cafe downstairs. The waitress knew her by name now. "Rough day?" she'd ask sometimes. And Bella would smile and say, "No, just life." Because that's what it had become. Not pain, not joy, just life. One evening, she sat by the window as it began to rain. The soft patter against the glass reminded her of the nights she used to lie awake beside Daniel, waiting for him to turn around, to reach for her, to see her. But now, when the rain fell, she no longer waited for anyone. She listened to it for herself. It was strange how healing didn't come as a single moment of relief. It came quietly, like drops of rain collecting in her heart, until one day she realized she could breathe again. Months later, Bella visited the old neighborhood again, not because she missed him, but because she wanted to see how it felt to stand where she once broke. She parked her car a little away from the house. From the outside, nothing had changed. The same porch light, the same fence, the same old tree. But everything inside her was different. She didn't walk up to the door. She didn't need to. She just stood there for a while, her hands in her coat pockets, the cold wind brushing against her hair. And for the first time, she whispered, "I forgive you." Not because he asked for it, but because she needed to let go completely. Later that night, she wrote in her journal, something she hadn't done in years. Her handwriting trembled slightly at first, but the words came out clear. Sometimes love doesn't end with a fight. Sometimes it just fades quietly while you keep hoping it'll come back. But when it doesn't, you learn to live again. You learn that silence isn't punishment, it's peace. You learn that being alone isn't empty, it's freedom. I wasn't perfect, but I was enough. And that's all I ever needed to be. Daniel never called, never showed up, and she never expected him to. Maybe he was too proud, or maybe too broken, but either way, their silence became the final thread that held them together, and then, even that faded. She sometimes saw his name pop up on old messages or emails she couldn't delete yet, but she didn't reply. She didn't need closure from him anymore. She had already found it, in the quiet, in herself. Seasons changed. Spring came, and with it, small signs of new life. Bella planted a few flowers on her windowsill, daisies, her favorite. Every morning she watered them, and it became her little ritual, a reminder that even after the coldest winters, something always blooms again. And sometimes, while sipping her tea, she thought, maybe that's what love was always meant to be. Not forever, just something that helps you grow, even if it breaks you first. One evening, she walked by the river and saw a young couple sitting on a bench, laughing, holding hands, completely lost in each other. For a second, Her heart ached with an old familiar longing, then just as quickly it softened. Because she realized she didn't envy them. She didn't crave that kind of love anymore, the kind that consumes you. She wanted peace, simplicity, truth, and she finally had it. As the sun set behind the water, she whispered quietly, "Some stories aren't meant to end with a happy ending. They're meant to end with peace." And she smiled, a real, full smile this time. Because she had finally reached that peace. Not by being loved again, but by learning to love herself enough to walk away. Thank you for listening till the end. If you've ever loved and lost, you'll understand Bella's silence. Subscribe, and stay with us for more stories that speak to the heart.